As I mentioned in a previous video, my plans were to go from Bryce Canyon all the way to St. George, Utah. But in reality, I changed my mind at the last moment and dropped into Cedar City, Utah, and spent another night at that Motel 6. Partially because the one in St. George was pretty full. Also, after navigating the pass in the snowy conditions, I was more tired than I thought I would have been from a hotel room. I think I'll be a lot happier doing that. You can see the intensity of the showers up on the mountains. From what I hear, you've been hearing up ahead, there's a pretty good thunderstorm with hail, everything like that. So, hey, nice to have an inexpensive hotel room. So anyway, here I am out in beautiful Utah, and I mean beautiful. It is stunningly beautiful country. Drive that I just took from Bryce back to Cedar City was a little bit eventful. There were a couple times where there was almost no visibility due to heavy snow. So at the last minute, I just dropped into the Motel 6 there in Cedar City, kind of regrouped, and then would head down from Cedar City down to St. George and have a relatively easy day. At least that was the plan. When I did get to St. George, Utah, I stayed in probably the roughest of any of the Motel 6s that I used on this trip. And by rough, I mean there were a lot of nefarious or possibly bad activities going on around that hotel. And in the room next to me, people were coming and going all night long. And I was watching the people, and they were a pretty rough crowd. I was doing my very best to be low profile and out of the way, and that continued throughout my stay there. It was an interesting Motel 6, and it required a $100 deposit in cash, so that should have told me something. But thanks to God's protection, I persevered and was able to make it work. One of the reasons why I stayed at the Motel 6 for a couple of days was we were being flooded. We had a deluge of rainfall. And interestingly enough, during the early years of St. George, that kind of heavy rain really made the life of the early settlers difficult. A little bit of history about St. George. It was part of what was known as the Cotton Mission during the Mormon Church's history. They sent 309 families down to the St. George area. It was thought that the climate would be conducive to growing cotton, which was a big concern, being influenced by the Civil War. St. George was known as Little Dixie because of that influence of those folks that knew how to grow cotton. George Smith is where the name St. George comes from, and he actually was instrumental in picking the 309 families that were asked to establish St. George. The times there were so difficult that they needed something to pull them out of their economic depression, and the original building of the temple took place there, and it was $800,000 in those days. And for the 1860s, that's a huge amount of money. But that was kind of the incentive that was made to employ people to help them economically. And so the temple that dominates the skyline in St. George has an interesting history. I don't necessarily like all the aspects of how hard it was for the folks that settled there, but it's an interesting history that was centered around the idea of growing cotton. Changing gears here a little bit, my whole life I was a pilot, and so I was able to get all my ratings at the minimum age. And I'll never forget working at the Imperial Valley Airport down near El Centro, California, in the early Skywest pilots coming in. And there were three pilots. There was Earl Snow, Jerry Fackrell, and Paul Laddie that were guys that were involved with flying. And to keep that operation alive in the early days, they had gone from Piper Cherokees and a Seneca to a Navajo and a Navajo chieftain. And these guys, after their normal flying, were flying illegal aliens back down to the Imperial Valley of California so they could be deported. I was managing the FBO at this time, and actually lived at the facility. What we didn't have was a fueler with a fuel truck, so we'd have to call our fueler in when Skywest flights were coming in. I got to know the pilots in a little bit about flying in Southern California in the wintertime, as our mountain passes are notorious for icing on airplanes. It can be very turbulent and very dangerous. And typically these guys came in late at night, somewhere after 9 p.m., sometimes to midnight or 1 p.m. So the pilots came in, and we all had a lot in common. We were all, had been general aviation flight instructors, and then we're flying charter. This was taking place in 1973, and by 1974, I was gone. I had left to fly for Scenic Airlines out of Las Vegas. But 1974 was a very pivotal year for Skywest Airlines. They were trying to decide whether they were going to stay in business or not. I know some of the people like Earl Snow stayed on, and Skywest is a very successful, large regional airline now. But those were the days where we were just trying to survive. In fact, like I said, I lived at the airport. I actually lived in the FBO because I didn't make enough money to have an apartment. And so we were all just scraping by. And I went on to have a successful major airline pilot career. And those guys built that Skywest Airlines up into a very large regional airline. But anyway, we're going to get back to photography. A little history from me on St. George. On this trip, I thought about going out and seeing if I could find any of those pilots, but figured they wouldn't remember me after over 40 years. I was just a guy that ran the FBO and, just met them briefly. I remember them. I have this mind of an elephant, but never mind. Anyway, back to Western Wanderlust.